Let's have a look at what's making news in print and online this morning. We're joined by Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, Ebony Bennett from Canberra. Ebony, good morning and welcome to News Breakfast.
G'day, thanks for having me.
Some interesting feature pieces in the wake of George Pell's funeral, the mass in Sydney, haven't there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's in what's likely to be very devastating news for survivors of child sexual abuse. Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, as part of his eulogy for Cardinal George Pell, who was found to have knowledge of child sexual abuse and failed to act on it, has described him as a saint for our times and likened his charges of child sexual abuse against him as enduring something like a modern-day crucifixion. And obviously that news was greeted, with awful consequences from child sexual abuse survivors who were outside the church and elsewhere across Australia looking at other elements of Cardinal Pell's legacy.
Yes, lots of passions on display, as you say, Ebony, both inside the cathedral and outside, as George Pell was laid to rest yesterday. Let's move on and talk about a very interesting story in the Sydney Morning Herald concerning former New South Wales Deputy Premier John Barilaro.
Yeah, this is another big piece of news. So the New South Wales Auditor-General looked into the emergency bushfire funding. It was a $100 million program provided by the New South Wales government in the wake of the Black Summer bushfires, and found that the Deputy Premier's office intervened in that program and directed the funding to coalition-held seats. So 96% of the projects ended up going to coalition-held seats, meaning that voters in Labor-held electorates missed out, even though I'm sure their emergency needs were just as great. So it's been described as pork barrelling, but really what we're looking at here is nothing short of the misuse of taxpayers' funds.
If you were in those electorates, those Labor electorates, and needed help and were reading this story today, you could be rightly feeling pretty cheesed off.
Yeah, you would just be gutted to feel so betrayed by, the government who's supposed to be looking out. And, pork barrelling, I guess, has become somewhat accepted over the years as part of, trying to win votes. But this is emergency funding. Almost 2,500 people lost their homes, and to think that the government wouldn't extend these funds simply because of how you voted. And of course, not everyone will have voted Labor in those electorates. I mean, it's just appalling, and people would be very rightly angry at this news.
Let's move on to the Canberra Times. A very interesting suggestion put forward by the IMF, Ebony, about JobSeeker here in Australia and what to do with it.
Yeah, the IMF has suggested replacing JobSeeker, our unemployment benefit, with a contribution scheme, an unemployment insurance scheme, as you see in many other advanced economies, basically because they say it's not enough. So during a big economic crisis like the global pandemic, it wasn't enough to sustain demand or protect the economy. Obviously, a lot of critics over many, many years have been calling for JobSeeker to be increased. It's well below the poverty line. And they've also suggested that the government take another look at the Stage 3 income tax cuts, which come in at a whopping cost of more than $250 billion over the next 10 years. It's a huge program, and they've suggested maybe it might be time to look at it again.
And looking at those, the current rate of JobSeeker, as you quite rightly point out, very low. It's $48 per single person living out of home. Most sensible people would agree that that is not nearly enough for those people, and clearly some pressure on the Treasurer Jim Chalmers to address, ahead of any consideration of an insurance scheme potentially down the track, but to address the level of JobSeeker in this year's May budget.
Yeah, I mean, it's well below the poverty line. Even business groups have come on board the campaign to kind of lift the rate because it's a barrier to employment. It doesn't give people enough to be able to afford sometimes to even get to a job interview. So it really does need to be examined.
On those Stage 3 tax cuts, I noted the Treasury yesterday saying that, he appreciated the regular assessment of the economy from the IMF, but that he wouldn't be taking their advice on the tax cuts.
Well, I think that remains to be seen. Governments always say they're not going to do something until they do it. And increasingly, so many people are looking at the size of these income tax cuts and who they're directed to, not to those who are struggling or who need it the most, and thinking, is this really the right way to spend, $300 billion odd over the next 10 years?
OK, let's finish up with The Guardian. It has a piece on where the AUKUS deal is at with continuing doubts over submarines, production timetables and the like. And Guardian features a contribution from the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull.
Yeah, discussing two former Prime Ministers this morning. So Malcolm Turnbull obviously has been a huge critic of ditching the submarine deal that he organised with the French government. But what he's saying here is Labor has inherited this scheme. It's now upon them to make sure that the nuclear submarine deal is able to be operated and maintained by Australia, that we have what he's calling sovereign defence capability. And he's saying that Labor hasn't answered that, and that if we can't maintain our own nuclear submarine system without the help of the United States or the United Kingdom, then effectively we'll be sharing sovereignty with one, perhaps two other countries. So it's definitely something to consider as this nuclear deal proceeds.
All right, Ebony, thanks very much.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day.